food and markets. And I first off, thank you for this opportunity, and also want to let you know that I regret that I do have to leave at 2:30. So you'll be in good hands with Ryan Patch. So, we're at this point of, I want to make sure that we're clear to the committee today. We have no ask. We don't need money. We're appreciative of the money that the legislature provided to us last year, the $1 million that will assist us in a pilot program. So if there is an ask and our program is successful, it's probably 2 years out. So very important to understand there's no ask today. Also, in doing this work, 3 years with the working group, a great makeup of individuals with just a wealth of knowledge. We're happy to say that we reached 100% consensus on the pilot program that Ryan will review today. So Ryan's going to give you a history of how we got here to where we are today. The report was delivered to you on the 15th of January. And Ryan's slideshows will give you that history, and then also an overview of the pilot program. The pilot program, we're proud to be working with our partners at USDA. We oftentimes hear that programs are hard to navigate, that we have many systems that farmers have to work with. So this is an opportunity for us to engage with our partners at USDA and try to work together with farmers so they don't have to work on 2 different systems without some technical assistance. So I'll turn it over to Ryan to give the overview of the history and pilot program. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, Ryan, please come on up.
Thank you, sir. All right. Thank you, Deputy Secretary Eastman. For the record, Ryan Patch with the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. I will be sharing my screen if I can navigate this. So far, so good. All right. Waiting. It's loading. Oh, I haven't seen that before. There you go. Aha! Excellent. So it was all that for a title slide. Sorry. Going to dive right in. As the Deputy Secretary shared, we submitted a report to the committee, the Subcommittee on Agriculture, House Committee on Ag, Food Resiliency and Forestry. The main report is 30 pages, answering the questions that were asked of the working group in the enabling legislation. The total report is 475 pages, including appendices, which include prior reports that were submitted by the working group, as well as some of the technical analysis that was conducted by the technical contractor that was retained by the working group. So there is a lot of information contained in there, and I am going to focus my remarks to just for the education of new members in the committee, kind of some of the statutory history of how we got to a PES working group. I will then speak about the working group process itself a little bit, and then spend most of the time trying to provide a summary of the proposed pilot program that was recommended with full consensus by the working group. So this conversation on health and soil health, as we touched on in some prior remarks I made to this committee that are related to soils and healthy soils, of course, interfaces not just with climate work and water quality, but is really the bedrock of this ecosystem services working group. The full title became the Payment for Ecosystem Services and Soil Health Working Group. And so that was a major focus. The first definition of healthy soils was established in Act 64 of 2015, Vermont's Clean Water Act. And then there was about 3 years of discussion back and forth about what is regenerative farming, what is regenerative soils, what does that mean for the state of Vermont? And then it culminated in my view, 2 companion bills, Act 64 of 2019, not 2015, and Act 83 of 2019. So Act 83 gave us the Soil Conservation Practice and Payment for Ecosystem Services Working Group, which was then retitled in the subsequent year to put Payment for Ecosystem Services first and to stand up soil health and removing the term practice, right? That was the main focus of the working group was we have a lot of successful pay for practice programs in the state. Example of the Farm Agronomic Practices Program. The program compensate farmers a portion of the cost of a money cover crop. Very good efficacy, cost effectiveness, and tracking. This group is focused on performance. How can we look at a performance standard for farms in Vermont and recognize farms who achieve that standard and then provide financial compensation for exceeding those standards? So this is on the left, just the legislative history, and on the right, the definition of healthy soils that was established. That is, I think, very useful and still salient. And then the definition of regenerative farming that was also promulgated in those bills. What really, I think, broke the logjam of discussions about what is regenerative farming and what are ecosystem services and got us to Act 83 of 2019 is hopefully what you see on the screen, and you do, a letter that was penned by the farmer watershed groups in the state of Vermont. We have a representative from the Champlain Valley Farmer Coalition here today. Brian Kemp was the signatory. He's still the president, I believe, and he was a member of the working group all throughout. But the three farmer watershed groups, Champlain Valley Farmers Coalition, Franklin Grand Isle Farmers Watershed Alliance, and the Connecticut River Watershed Farmers Alliance, held a joint hearing with the House and Senate Agriculture and Natural Resource Committees to stand up the fact at that time, back in 2019, agriculture was still at the same proportion of contribution, around 95, 96%. And they were setting up, look at how much agriculture is doing. You can hire farmers to do more, and we're willing and ready to do more. And since that time, you can just see the scale of adoption has increased on farms. And so that was a pretty salient recommendation from the working group, and in my view, led to the passage of Act 83 of 2019. Again, these are the pay for practice programs, and the PES working group is focusing on pay for performance programs, which I'll touch on in a moment. And then again, as every time I'll come in here, I'll just remind us in the water space, not only is agriculture contributing significant amount, it's also the most cost effective. And so there's a lot of reason to focus on, just from an economic consideration, investments in agriculture yielding significant environmental benefit at a low price point, depending on whether you're looking at phosphorus, carbon, et cetera. So a bit about the legislative purpose. The Act 83 of 2019 established the working group to recommend financial incentives designed to encourage farmers to implement ag practices that improve soil health, enhance crop resilience, increase carbon storage and stormwater storage capacity on farms, and to reduce agricultural runoff to waters. So an acknowledgement in the purpose that there are a lot of ways that agricultural land can provide numerous ecosystem service benefits.
Brian, sorry, can
Yes.
just, and I know we haven't given you a whole lot of time. And
Sure.
want to be sure that we do cover everything, but I think maybe just stopping to absorb this slide would be useful for me anyway. That those are the four main items. Yeah. Okay. So improve soil health and enhance crop resilience, increase carbon storage and stormwater storage capacity, and reduce runoff. Okay.
And in the title of the working group and what a lot of the technical contractor research focused on, and the focus of a lot of members of the working group, was improving soil health can provide all those benefits. You increase organic matter content. That's a measure of soil health that improves the crop's ability to withstand climatic extremes. More organic matter means more carbon in the soils, therefore more ability to hold stormwater runoff and precipitation events, and therefore leads to reduced runoff and to agricultural water, or reduce agricultural runoff to surface water. So that soil health and how to measure and value and track change is where the working group puts so much of its effort to understand what methods, models, and approaches can be used to track that improvement. And that's, in my mind, why the working group took so long, is it was a very thorough investigation of, this is what we want to hold up, how do we track and account for that? And that's where a lot of the technical research happened.
Representative O'Brien, did you have your hand up?
I did. Ryan, maybe you'll cover this later, but could you just give us a theoretical example of a farm doing something where the practice is paid for versus the performance?
Yes. An example would be, but there's a very concrete example. We can use agency programs. One, the Farm Agronomic Practices Program. A farmer can sign up. We have a cap of about $8,000 per farm. And so that's about 212 acres, 200 or so acres of cover crop that can be implemented. That cover crop is implemented, the agency verifies, we pay the farmer, we send that geospatial tracking to DEC. DEC uses the soils and other information to give us and applies a phosphorus reduction efficiency to say the application of these cover crops with this method of establishment on these soils yields this benefit, which is X kilograms of phosphorus. And so that is a paying for a practice and then quantifying the outcome. The Agency of Ag has a performance program that we call Vermont Pay for Performance, and that uses modeling, which is informed by state-specific edge of field monitoring. So it's informed by measurement in fields that informed a statewide calibrated and validated model, which you can construct to look at performance in a number of different ways. That program, to try to summarize, it's very complicated, but looks at TMDL baseline. TMDL said your farm was loading this much back in 2008. This is your farm's management on each and every farm field, and you have applied these conservation practices. Across all these farm fields, you are reducing this many pounds of phosphorus from the baseline that EPA established for your farm. And so looking at their performance metric, have you gone over a particular threshold is an example of this is, you always have to set a baseline. Where are you setting the baseline and how are you tracking performance? That's always the tension in establishing these programs. If you look for, year on year progress, well, there's diminishing returns and it doesn't reward those that have been doing those practices all along. And so if you just have a pay for performance program that looks for continual year on year improvement, you're very likely going to leave behind those farms that have been operating at a high level for a long time and are incentivizing new farmers that are new to a practice to come in because they're going to get a huge benefit first couple of years of adopting those practices. A threshold program says, here's the EPA baseline. You are applying these conservation practices. You've improved your loss. It's kind of strange to say it's a loss, but you've improved the loss. You've reduced phosphorus transport from your fields to this watershed by X%. And that program pays past 40%, it pays a price per phosphorus, right? So you reduced 100 pounds, we pay $100 a pound, that's math, 10,000, it's money, right? We'll pay you this many dollars for that reduction. So that's an example of the pay for practice programs, which we know are efficient and do a good job, but kind of questions of performance and the ability to track and from the same data set, estimate benefits that aren't just phosphorus, right? You can do sediment, you can do nitrogen, you can do carbon, and you can come up with different ways of valuing the environmental benefit of the improvement from a baseline. And so that's an example of ways that the pay for performance program the Agency of Ag is running could, which is different from this PES working group recommendations, just making that clear, but that's a performance program that could have other parameters. And so I apologize for going on there, but that's really the crux, I think, of one of the issues that the working group is struggling with is what baseline do you set? What thresholds and method of improvement are we looking for? And they wanted to focus on a holistic farm-wide outcome, not just, conservation practice implementation from a no-till grazing or cover crop as examples. So.
Representative Supernant, did you have a?
Yes, I did. Just to tail off that, I guess I'm not understanding why performance would continue to diminish in value as opposed to practice, where if the performance is maintaining its performance levels throughout the entirety of your agricultural career, why would that suddenly lose value?
So I think that's a great question because, so to be clear, it doesn't lose value, but if a program is structured where you have to show an improvement year on year and you're only paid for the improvement, farmers that have been managing at a very high level and have applied a whole suite of conservation practices for 20 years, and let's say we're using organic matter content, they may have already reached a saturation point for organic matter in their soils, past which they can't actually have a biological or physical improvement in the content or rate of that organic matter. And so that diminishing return of effort and eventually may not be able to show an improvement is what I was trying to say about the year-on-year improvement method. I think there's a lot of value in recognizing, on the climate side, the soil carbon stocks that are present in ag soils and the value of keeping that carbon locked up in the soils as a premise for rewarding management that stewards that sort of farming that keeps the carbon in the soil. And so I hope I didn't muddy the waters with that comment, but there's a lot of value in keeping it there because it's a lot harder to build it up over time. My comment was about if you just have a straight performance improvement program, it doesn't always recognize all the effort it took to get to that point. And some farmers may not functionally be able to improve it very much if they've been managing that way for a long time.
Right. So there is an advocating for both a practice-based and a performance-based to be in a dual partnership together to be effective.
I think that's my conclusion. You need both.
Sure.
And a performance that is focused on a threshold is more able to reward farmers, as an example, that have been using those practices all along. So let's say we have that TMDL baseline, and since the TMDL, total maximum daily load for phosphorus for the Lake Champlain Basin, really the driving thing behind Act 64 of 2015, we have this phosphorus loading, ag is 41%. They're going to be 55% of the cleanup. How are they going to get there? And so the modeling that they used had rather, full width tillage as an example, but let's say they've been no-till or grass the whole time. If we set the threshold at that base performance level, their management is at a point where there's a lot of benefit and they haven't been doing it for so long. And so if they're beyond that threshold, we can pay on that performance. And so setting a threshold and setting the baseline is an important, I think, consideration for a performance program. And the working group was less in favor of continual improvement and more in favor of that threshold-based approach. And that's what's ultimately reflected in the recommendation for the pilot program. Okay, legislative history. A lot of people. The working group has submitted 2 other reports. One was an interim report, another was an update report. We just submitted the final report. There were 18 members on this working group, representatives from small scale diversified farming, the 3 farmer watershed groups, state, federal, nonprofit, university research, a large soil health advocate organizations, a really good, I think, representation of different types and sizes of farms and interests around the table. So, where's my definition? What are ecosystem services? I put the definition here. Sorry, I didn't say definition. This is a definition that the working group used in all of its report. That ecosystems are the conditions and processes through which natural ecosystems and the species that make them up sustain and fulfill human life, i.e. the set of ecosystem functions that are useful to humans. And so the most common, this is the wheel of ecosystem services that can be related to agriculture, there's probably many more, but this is an example of some of the ways. And the most common ecosystem services that we are aware of are the provisioning of food and fiber. We're most commonly aware of you're farming to grow food or other outputs from agriculture and generally selling it to some sort of market. Through that process, we know there are multiple different ways where environmental management can have impacts on aesthetic values, the efficiency of photosynthesis, pollinator support, water regulation and climate regulation. And so embedded in all of this is trying to acknowledge that in producing the food and fiber on Vermont farms, what they are compensated for is the amount of food and fiber they produce. Very rarely is the ecosystem service benefit embedded in the commodity price, right? That's very much just the price for food. And so if you want to value ecosystem service provisioning beyond the food and fiber, you have to think about a way to quantify the ecosystem service benefit, measure it, and then how to pay for it. And so if you want to as part of the food production process, encourage more soil carbon sequestration, right? You have to come up with a way to evaluate, measure, and pay on that enhancement to an ecosystem service program. There are at the end of this process, one criticism of the term payment for ecosystem services that was used and was not the intent of, I think, either the legislature or the working group, and certainly was, I think, rejected by many members of the working group, was some of the commodification and transactional nature of a payment system that attempts to measure and commodify natural systems is intrinsically linked to some potentially problematic outcomes related to ownership and what are you evaluating, who are you evaluating. But the intent of this was to, or at least from my perspective, it was an attempt to acknowledge that the growing of food and crops can provide benefits beyond just food and fiber, and encouraging management on farms that supports biodiversity, supports improved environmental outcomes, that the stormwater attenuation is where the working group was striving to design a program that would support that, and why the working group settled on a state-federal partnership where it's public interests that are evaluating and providing that payment. So I don't know if I've done the best justice to that critique, but it was an important part just that framed the whole term payment for ecosystem services, and trying to acknowledge the group did not want to support that. We're going to have carbon credits that are sold on some exchange and farmers will get paid. No, they wanted to keep the quantification of benefit local and the payment in public hands. Here's a summary of the appropriations that were made in service of this. The $250,000 in 21, which helps support the technical research aspect, as well as the facilitation services for the working group, as well as $1 million that will support the pilot program implementation that came in 2022. Here's just a very high level output of all of the kind of deliverables or ways to measure what happened in this program. The working group met 33 times as a full group since 2019. So a 3-year process, that's all 18 members getting together. That doesn't include the steering committee meetings nor the sub-task group meetings that were a part of evaluating some of the specific research and topic areas. The Consensus Building Institute was the facilitation service that was through 3 contracts selected by the working group to provide facilitation services, and they were instrumental in coordinating and getting us to the finish line. The other purpose of the funding was to contract identified research needs. The University of Vermont Extension and some of their partners were selected to do the investigation, and they generated 7 technical research reports that are included in the final report that were instrumental in helping us understand some of the questions about measurement, modeling, and evaluation. The working group developed 6 pilot program concepts from pay for practice, pay for performance, a whole bunch of different approaches. And in the end, they settled on one pilot program approach that was adopted by full consensus, which I think is a really significant achievement given how long it took, how many different ways there are to try to quantify ecosystem services, and a number of the different viewpoints on the committee. So I really want to commend the group on their coming together to recommend that. So this is kind of the summary slide of what this pilot program is going to look like. And then I'm going to dig into kind of the steps of the state-federal partnership. So this is kind of not the mission statement, but to try to characterize how the ecosystem pilot program is going to operate. The program is an enhancement to the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, their Conservation Stewardship Program, CSP. It is a program to incentivize farmer enrollment in the CSP program and to accelerate and compensate conservation through farmer adoption of practice enhancements required for CSP enrollment. So kind of a mouthful. As you see, CSP is an existing federal program. which is one of the largest conservation programs nationwide, but is rather underutilized in Vermont for a number of different reasons. And so Vermont is very good at working with our federal partners, identifying gaps that are unique to our generally smaller scale farms in Vermont, and trying to fill those obstacles or barriers to enrollment through the state enhancement. And so that's essentially what's proposed here is great program, a lot of opportunity, especially in the Inflation Reduction Act for further funding the CSP in the future. And so if we can start getting farms into this program, NRCS can carry them through and bring more in. But it's really an intentional state federal effort to say, here's a good program. Here are the ways it quantifies ecosystem services and compensates farmers. And we're going to state federal partnership to support further farmer enrollment.
Love it.
What's your outreach to farmers? If you're saying you're having a hard time getting them sort of energized about this, how are you reaching them?
So I don't think, so the CSP program in particular, to dive into that, there is millions of dollars every year that goes out through grants to service providers that provide technical assistance outreach. And we have more applications than we can fund in all the other funding programs. So EQIP, the NRCS EQIP, the Agency of Ag BMP program, the SEEP program, which is our capital equipment program. We have more subscription and applications than we have funding. CSP doesn't have that because it is, as you'll see, a rather complicated multi-step process that is going to require specifically trained technical assistance providers to support farmers to navigate through that. And it takes a lot more information than a regular application. So you want to apply to our cover crop program? It's a one pager. This is my name. I want to do this many acres. I'm in this watershed. Okay, we'll get a W-9. You're enrolled. It's a rather simple process. This requires whole farm information, your nutrient management plan. You have to go through and enter your information about your specific fields and your specific management. And then it's evaluated for performance in the federal assessment tool, and you may not meet the cut. So you may do all this effort to apply and then not even be eligible for compensation. And so we're trying to, with this partnership, try to overcome some of those barriers by providing to, an incentive payment to get folks in the door to plan regardless of where they end up on that evaluation.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Sure.
Sorry, I see somebody on the side wanted to make a comment, and I'm just going to ask that you hold it until later. Yeah, thank you. John.
Just a quick question. When the working group got together, did they decide just to really focus on working ag land? Because you talk about farms, we know a lot of farms have significant forests, for example.
Yep.
Is that part of the conversation or not?
Absolutely. Not just infield, but edge of field. And by edge of field, not just the buffers, but the areas that are not farmed. There's a lot of different terms for it, but whether it's a fallow area, just the areas that are too wet and soggy, the slope between the forest and the cropland. Yes, it's acknowledging that farmers manage a whole lot of land, and how do you quantify and assess that? And CSP does a good job because you can enroll a whole farm. It's not just, you have to do 2 applications. So if you want to enroll your forest land, you have to do a forest application. But if you do your ag land, you're going to be looking at the cropland, the pasture land, the headquarters, and then in this program, they call it associated ag land. And so that's the wetlands, the fallow fields, the areas that aren't actively farmed, but they are assessed for the criteria as well. And so people really like that approach and acknowledging a holistic assessment of, a farmer managing a farm is more than just the where the cows are and what you're growing crops. There's a whole area to be evaluated. And so there's other organizations that are investigating ecosystem services. The number of forestry folks were, again, maple sugaring is one of those co-held areas between Department of Forests and Agency of Ag, right? It's maple sugaring. Anyway, so yes, the CSP program can do it all. It can evaluate forests and it can evaluate cropland and the areas in between, and people really like that. Threshold program. So as I said, baseline. So threshold, you have to meet or exceed a threshold to be eligible for payment. This is going to pay farmers to engage in planning and upfront payments for implementing practices they may need. It provides farmers flexibility in the program to identify the conservation practices that fit their management and their technology. And then it's going to be iterative process of review. So are we successful? What are we missing? What ways can we improve the application process, et cetera? And so it is a pilot, and we intend to review it after the first year. Okay, so digging into what I'm going to attempt to do is very quickly summarize the conservation stewardship payment program for you, and then the interventions that make up the PES pilot program. So this is the 8-step planning process that you need before you get paid in CSP. You first have to fill out an application, then you have to go and work with your conservation planner to get your whole farm information into the NRCS system. And this isn't just outlining your fields, it includes your management, nutrient management applications, crop rotation, grazing type, a whole bunch of information and time. NRCS will then rank your application against the criteria in each one of those areas, and you may not make the cut. You may put all that time in and you may not meet those threshold criteria, and so then you're not eligible for payment in CSP. So once you enter all your information, are ranked, and you will meet the threshold criteria, you then have to make the conservation plan. And this is a 5-year program, so you have to commit to a 5-year plan. And that can take a lot on a farm that has a lot of crop rotations or may need to anticipate management changes that need to happen in year 3. And so building a conservation plan that will meet the threshold standards but will be flexible enough for agriculture is another potential bottleneck in the system. And then you have to implement the plan. So you sign the contract, you implement the plan, and then a year later you get paid. So the compensation, there is a minimum payment rate, which is good. So it is favorable sometimes for small farms and very small farms to get involved in the program. They do pay per acre and for practice enhancements. And so it can be, remuneration for the performance outcomes, but it can be a long time from application to implementation to verification before a farmer is paid. And so we wanted to attempt to address wrong direction some of the gaps. And so the first one that was identified by the working group is there needs to be more technical assistance provided to support farmers through this process, both with application, with the planning, the development of the conservation plan, and then to support them to do the reporting. So out of the $1 million, about $250,000 over 2 years is proposed to be used to support additional qualified technical assistance providers at qualified, we'll do an RFP, but get the technical folks that can access the NRCS system that can do this work and make sure they're available to support farmers through this process. Wrong direction again, sorry. So this is a 1-year program, while CSP is a 5-year program commitment. The PES pilot will be 1 year. Just this first year, there's a lot of upfront costs and sunk time for farms. And so the first opportunity for intervention is what we're calling a planning completion payment. So it's a $2,000 payment for doing planning, right? So you go through the whole process, enter your information, you get an output about whether or not you meet the thresholds. That's what's going to be needed to provide that payment. And as well as, I don't want to say like a diversion program, but let's say you don't meet the standards, or you end up thinking, well, this is a lot of work, CSP isn't going to provide me enough bang for the buck, or you're not meeting the standard and you need to implement a few practices before you get there, there will be direction to other programs, whether there's NRCS EQIP, the Agency of Farm Agronomic Practices programs, so those pay for practice programs, or there's many other pay for practice programs that are out there. But you're not meeting it, we're not going to leave you high and dry. There'll be direction for you can implement these practices and then come back in a year or two and try to get into the program again. Another intervention is what is called the contract incentive payment. So this is, you've done the pre-planning, you've developed a full 5-year conservation plan, and you've signed that commitment with NRCS. This provides both the incentive to say thank you for signing the agreement, that's a serious commitment, as well as what's called a variable practice implementation payment. So people wanted to keep the practice completion payment, the contract incentive payment, and the practice incentive payment. Sorry, there's so many acronyms, I apologize. But basically keeping the planning payment and the contract signing payment flat rate, $2,000, $1,500. The balance of the financial assistance monies, the balance of that $1 million will then be divided between the farms once the full cohort is enrolled in the program. And so farmers can expect to receive an additional $4,500 to $9,500 per farm from the PES program. And this program is open to those farms that are in the middle of a CSP contract, as an example. So they will, they've gone through all this and they will be able to receive a $3,500 similar to, because they had to do the planning, they had to do the contract incentive payment. And so we wanted to make sure we filled those gaps for them that are already enrolled in the program, but they won't be eligible for the practice incentive payment because they're already doing the implementations. So this will be in addition to the payments that farmers are eligible through the CSP portion of the program. So they will be eligible for a per acre payment based on their category, as well as their enhancement practices, and then one other consideration. And so these programs taken together, the farmers are assessed for performance, right? In the planning process, they use the conservation assessment resource tool, CART, which will take all of their farm and field information, take their managements, and compare their farm management to a national threshold. And only where you're exceeding the criteria and enough categories are you eligible to enroll in CSP. And so the first phase is just to, was envisioned as a 3-phase process. The first is these upfront incentive payments for planning and implementation, and learning if this program can be utilized by Vermont farmers, right? It's not currently well utilized. Can we drive up that utilization rate? And then phase 2 and 3 are getting more to some of the targeted resource concerns that folks wanted to emphasize, whether it's biodiversity, whether it's soil health measures specifically, but there's an opportunity to apply for grant funding from NRCS to bring additional monies to support more targeted payments in the CSP program. And so this phase 1 is just to get out there, learn with the farmers, see what practices and farms are and are not making it, and then to see where we can hopefully be successful in securing that grant funding to bring additional enhancements to those resource concerns that we want to provide additional remuneration for folks that are meeting those thresholds. And then the phase 3 is what was always envisioned, which is pay for performance, right? Trying to get to some performance measures that are specific to pounds of phosphorus, pounds of nitrogen, tons of carbon, and attaching a payment for those performance achievements on a farm. And so that's the goal for the 3rd phase of the program. The second slide of this presentation provides the kind of link to the 475-page report. This PES website is where all the other information is. And I am more than happy to answer any specific questions and dig into any degree of detail folks would like about CSP or the other pilot options that were discussed and what was found in the technical resource report. So thanks for your opportunity.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. Representative Templeman?
Yeah, so my head's swimming.
Sorry.
No, you're amazing. You just whipped right through this thing. So yeah, it's the details that I'm really curious about, the metrics. Mm-hmm. And going back to a previous conversation we had, I was concerned about certain practices being adopted, but then other practices counteracting the effects. Like, for example, if I were to engage in a rotational grazing program that, let's just say that particular program was shown in the model to sequester a certain amount of or improve soil carbon content, but then I were to spread nitrogen fertilizer, which has the counter effect, are all of these metrics being taken into consideration in the performance end? Meaning that, at the end of all of these practices, is there a before and after measurement of soil carbon, and are the payments that are being given out based on that improvement?
The CART tool will include in a grazing example, all of the nutrient inputs, whether that's from 12-hour moves, 24-hour moves, 3-day moves, 1-week moves, set stock, as well as any synthetic or other nutrients that are applied. And so in the assessment for the soil health categories or the water categories, it is inclusive of looking at those inputs on the soil and what's exported, in the case of phosphorus, to the edge of the field. Your question about quantifying the net benefit from multiple different practices is where the research is focused in Vermont currently. We have very good edge of field studies that look at phosphorus, which have been embedded in a number of different models, which enable the agency to run the pay for performance program for phosphorus. We have a grant from USDA NRCS to look at nitrogen and soil carbon specifically. And we are going to be engaged in that work so that we can have a performance model which can, rather than just directionally, give us a sense of what is the net benefit or loss in some cases on a particular field. But it is mediated by a number of site-specific characteristics, at least soil slope.
So the answer is, if I were to condense what you just said, not yet, but you're working on it.
I think the model that we have, that USDA has for CART, what tier of modeling are you looking for? You're looking for a specific pound of phosphorus, a specific
Let's just
unit.
talk about carbon, soil carbon right now. I mean, phosphorus is equally important, but just soil carbon for this conversation.
For this conversation, the CART tool before that RSET is inclusive of all of those interventions, whether it's synthetic fertilizer, the grazing intensity, or manure that's applied on a field. And the model can include all of those at once and can assess it against those NRI standards, those National Resource Inventory standards that are used to set those thresholds in the program. And so at that course level, yes, it is inclusive of that. Getting to the 4 tons of CO2 equivalents abated through this, we're not there yet.
Okay.
But we are in the directional, I will say the directionality, very good. That unit output, we're not there yet.
So do you feel that this program, and I understand it's in its infancy and this is a chicken or egg sort of thing, like you got to do some practices to figure this stuff out. But is there a chance that people practicing a certain set of methodologies could go through this program, get paid for it, and in the end, not actually have the results achieved?
Not as this program is structured, in my opinion.
In your opinion?
I think you do not want to, I think that's why it took 3 years. You don't want to support a program that's going to have a maladaptive outcome. In the end, you don't want to support a practice that is net worse in all these ways. And I think there's a lot of international evidence that the conservation practices that are measured and modeled in this program have a directionally complementary benefit to the environmental goals of the state that we're looking at, which is that list of 4 things: the soil health, the water quality outcomes, the stormwater retention. That directionally, yes, good, there are benefits. How much of a benefit and then adding a value to that to pay the farmer is what gets very expensive to measure and very complicated to get to the discrete. You did 3.2 tons per acre, you did 2.5. We're not there. The directionality, I think, is very good. And I'm confident in saying that, it is going to result in a net benefit for a number of different environmental indicators.
I'm sorry, can I continue?
We're being called to the floor. So what I suggest is well, thank you, Ryan. Yeah, I'm going to suggest that we stop. Representative Temple, please feel free to follow up. I'm sure Ryan would be happy to chat offline. And just want to be sure that we're all able to get down there and take a little break if we need to beforehand. Deputy Secretary Eastman, if you're still there, thank you for joining us earlier. And committee, we'll see you all tomorrow at 9.